Hello there, and welcome to my Neltharus Mythic Dungeon Guide, not to be mistaken with Neltharion's Lair. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in a Neltharus run. Neltharus is a pretty cool dungeon thematically, and judging by its relative difficulty on PTR, may prove to be one of the easier dungeons among the lineup, with one boss that sorely sticks out as being harder than the rest. I'll be making a guide on all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 2. I'll also be uploading a recap video every week, where I discuss the cool new tips and tricks I've discovered over the weeks. If you want to catch either of those, be sure to subscribe. Just like with my previous guides, I'll be marking important or impactful mob abilities in red, and less important abilities in green. Additionally, I'll be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleeds for Draktheirs, and poisons or diseases. Let's get going! The dungeon has 4 bosses, and you can choose to go either left or right first. In this guide, I'll be going left first. You enter the dungeon and are first faced by a couple of Kalashi Wardens. These Wardens have 2 abilities. First is Blazing Slash. It's a single target tank buster. Their second and important ability is Volcanic Guard. Volcanic Guard is a 3-second cast, which deals a significant damage in a frontal after a few seconds. Tanks try to face these Wardens away from the party, and everyone else should just dodge it. Past the first set of Wardens are 2 Spine Crushers and 2 Aura Elementals. These Spine Crushers are fairly simple. They only have a tank buster called Brutal Strike. The tooltip mentions it knocks back the tank in addition to doing damage, but in my testing they don't knock back. So maybe tanks can parry the knockback, or they don't knock back at all. That's it for the Spine Crusher, really easy. The Aura Elementals are deceptively weak. Alone they don't do very much. They start with a shield called Granite Shell, and it's pretty big. You can and should dispel it. They don't recast it at any point. However, in the next pack is a Kalashi Thaumaturge. The Thaumaturges are the most dangerous mobs in this area, primarily casting Magma Conflagration, a direct damage channel that deals a lot of continuous damage to one targeted player. The problem is you cannot interrupt it, so you'll have to use stops and stuns to stop it. Practice caution when pulling these mobs. In the absence of Aura Elementals, that's all the Thaumaturge does, actually not too bad. But should you pull a pack with a Thaumaturge and an Aura Elemental? The Thaumaturge has a new ability called Molten Core. They'll cast it at the Aura Elemental, and if they successfully finish the cast, they will level up the Elemental and turn it into a Molten Elemental, permanently. The Molten Elemental is disgusting. It will indefinitely cast Molten Core, applying a stack of Molten Vulnerability to all players hit every 3 seconds. If you miss the interrupt on Molten Core, it's going to be a race to see who can kill who first. Because the stacks grow infinitely, the Molten Elemental will eventually kill you if you don't kill it. So you'll want to interrupt Molten Core at all costs. It is priority number 1. And finally is the Kalashi Plunderer. They only have 1 ability, Explosive Concoction. It's an ability with a long cast time, and it's just a swirly to dodge. It moves really quick when it does cast though, so don't be greedy with your casts. That's all the unique mobs in the first area, and now we make our way to the first boss, Magmatusk, the Molten Mammoth. This boss is wicked hard. Magmatusk's biggest mechanic is Magma Tentacle. They will start the fight with 2 stacks, and the more stacks they have, the harder the fight will be. The boss's first ability is Blazing Charge. They'll turn to the farthest player and charge in that player's direction. It doesn't track, so that player should sidestep. At the end of the charge, Magmatusk will shoot out a magma wave for each stack of Magma Tentacle. Additionally, the charge itself will leave behind a trail of liquid hot magma. You don't want to stand in it, of course. Tanks, you'll want to pull the boss out of those magma puddles, as if the boss is standing in any puddles, they will do 50% more damage. The boss also casts Magma Lob, throwing a swirly at a random player. Just sidestep it, but it also leaves a magma puddle, so make sure the boss is not standing in those as well. Next is the boss's frontal, Lava Spray. The boss will turn to a random player and shoot in that player's direction. This ability tracks the player, so if it targets you, stand still and everyone else should move around you. This frontal deals 100% more damage for every tentacle the boss has. And finally, Magmatusk's ultimate, at 100 energy, the boss will cast Volatile Mutation, exploding the room and applying Magma Eruption to all players. It is a dot. The dot lasts 5 seconds, but lasts 5 seconds longer for each stack of Magma Tentacle the boss has. The boss starts with 2, so by default this dot will last 15 seconds. After casting their ult, Magmatusk will receive 1 additional stack of Magma Tentacle permanently. The boss's stacks grow fairly quickly, so the fight gets really hard really fast. You need to kill the boss before the damage overwhelms your healer and your party. Based on my testing, the boss reaches 100 energy in precisely 25 seconds, So give or take, the boss will reach 5 stacks a minute and 30 seconds into the fight. 5 stacks is the max as well for my testing. Then you jump out a window, or rather a hole in the wall, and make your way to the other side of the dungeon. There's a small ledge you can walk on to minimize fall damage if you don't have slow falling of some sort. There are only 5 unique mobs in the area before the second boss, actually quite simple, but there is a lot of them. The first you'd probably face is a pack that consists of multiple tamed phoenixes. The phoenixes can be fairly deadly in large numbers. They repeatedly cast Ember Reach at a random party member, dealing some damage. They spam this repeatedly, so you can't really possibly hope to interrupt all of them, so you should use AoE stops and line of sights. Caring for the phoenixes are normally a group of Kalashi hunters. The hunters can be fairly annoying. They primarily throw a spear at a random player, and if it hits, that player will be incapacitated for 10 seconds. That is a lot of time and you do not want that to happen. It's a swirly, so dodge it. If it does happen you get hit by the spear, you either wait the 10 seconds, or the party has to destroy the spear, pinning you down. The hunters also occasionally cast Bold Ambush at a random party member, jumping towards them. This can make fighting them quite annoying as they do jump around a lot. Try not to be too far from your tank so they don't jump around too far. Past the first doorway, the first enemy you'd see is the mini-boss, Overseer Lahar. In most runs, I imagine you'd skip him, but he's actually not that difficult, so you can pull him if you want to. The first cast is Burning Roar, a fairly large AoE stomp around him, which knocks you back and interrupts you. Just walk out of it, really. Next is Eruptive Crush. The Overseer puts a large swirly around the tank, which everyone, including the tank, will want to step out of, and when it lands, several smaller swirlies will shoot out in multiple directions. Just dodge them swirlies. And finally, this one's for the tank. The mini-boss has a buff called Imbued Magma. This will cause 50% of his attacks to apply a burning dot. Tanks, you'll want to consider this when combining this mini-boss with other packs. The fourth mob would be the Kalashi Trainee. The trainee barely casts abilities, with their main ability, Magma Fist. If you see Magma Fist, just avoid standing in the frontal, it's quite easy. When the trainee goes below 50% health, they will cast Fired Up, granting them a permanent 50% haste buff. You'll want to soothe this. And the last mob is the Kalashi Bone Tender. The name is fairly descriptive of the mob's abilities. They continuously cast Throw Bone at a random party member, dealing direct damage. This can make it quite difficult to gather them up, so you might want to use line of sights to group them up. Their other ability is Mend Clay. When an enemy that isn't the Bone Tender goes below 90% health, they will attempt to cast Mend Clay at that enemy. You'll want to interrupt this, as it does heal for a considerable amount every second for 12 seconds. And finally, there is a little mechanic in this room that you can play with, called Burning Chain. It sort of demonstrates a mechanic you use on the next boss. You can pick up the chain and start dragging it. Should you drag the chain through an enemy, the enemy will explode, tripping the chain, taking a lot of damage and getting stunned for 2 seconds. It is very powerful, and the best teams will utilize this to their maximum potential. But be careful, as holding the chains does a lot of damage to you, so use a defensive or an immunity if you want to do it. And before you get any bright ideas and want to pull the entire dungeon onto these chains only affect the mobs in this area, so trainees, bone tenders, and hunters. Other mobs don't trigger them. Using the chain grants you a debuff which prevents you from using another one for 4 minutes, so make it count. And now we meet the second boss of the dungeon, Chargath, Bane of Scales. Chargath is a fairly simple boss with 2 normal abilities and 2 large abilities. The first normal ability is Dragon Strike. He will target a random player and charge to that player, dealing damage and knocking them back. That player will have a bleed applied to them, in addition to taking some upfront damage. You'll want to dispel this if you have an evoker in your party. Based on my testing, the boss may cast this on summoned units. That's definitely a bug. His other normal ability is Magma Wave. He'll turn to a player and shoot out a wave of lava in that direction. It's fairly easy to sidestep. I'm pretty sure the white cone is just a visual, it doesn't actually do damage. Right before the boss hits 100 energy, Chargath will cast his big ability, Grounding Spear. 3 players, not including the tank, will be pinned by a spear. They will take some damage and be tethered to the impact location. This impact location will spawn a magma circle that you'll want to run out of, and you'll be tethered to it by a chain. If the boss walks through these chains, he'll be affected by Fetter. At 3 stacks of Fetter, the boss will be stunned. Additionally, when the boss trips the chain, he also applies 1 stack of Slag Eruption to the entire party. If you trip all 3 chains at the same time, you will wipe. There is no way you can do that. So the play here is to break 1 chain, wait for the buff to drop, break another chain, wait for that one to drop, and then the 3rd one. Play carefully, as you will need the stun to stop the boss's ultimate Fiery Focus. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will fixate on the tank, charging to them relentlessly. While he's doing this, he will continuously do a lot of damage to any player within 6 yards, so everyone needs to kite, including the tank. Additionally, fire swirlies will spawn out of the boss, so sidestep those as well. The only way to stop this cast early is to stun him with the chains. And the best part, when he's stunned by the chains, he takes a lot more damage. So plan out your cooldowns carefully for this boss. And that's the boss fight. After that, the door opens to your right and we can now proceed to the third boss. You'll face a few enemies you've seen before, Kalashi Hunters, Bone Tenders, and Phoenixes, though you do pass through what seems to be a barracks. Be careful pulling mobs here, as if you pull one mob, generally a few sleeping mobs will come and help that mob. So plan your routes carefully. To the left, near one of the Kalashi Bone Tenders, is an interactable object called the Kalashi Goulash. If you have Cooking 25, you can finish the goulash and everyone can eat it. This grants everyone 3 stacks of Kalashi Goulash. It's an extra action ability, which grants you 65% movement speed for 50 seconds, out of combat of course. That's pretty good, and considering how big this dungeon is, size-wise, you probably want to make full use of this. So you pass by the Sleeping Hunter, and you make your way up the steps and face new mobs. The first of which is the Kalashi Lava Bearer. The Lava Bearer carries a cauldron of lava on their back. When they melee the tank, they will spawn a puddle of lava nearby. They'll also occasionally throw lava at a random player, spawning a puddle at that player's location. And finally, on death, they leave behind a large puddle of lava. Everything about this guy is to do with lava, it's crazy. Just don't stand in lava, really. The pack will also contain a Lava Flare. The Lava Flare only casts one ability, Melt, a direct damage ability. My testing has been inconclusive. I'm pretty sure this targets a random player, but it prefers the tank normally. The second pack has more flares, accompanied by a Kalashi Iron Torch. Their important ability is Mote of Combustion, an interruptible cast where they apply a magic dot to a random player. This stacks and does quite a bit of damage, so you should prioritize kicking it or dispelling it if you miss it. They also cast a familiar ability, Scorching Breath, a 2-second cast frontal cone. Farther through you face another mob called the Kalashi Bone Splitter, probably the second most dangerous mob in this area. They cast 2 abilities. Bone Splitter is a charge at a random player farther than 8 yards. You can line of sight this cast. The right thing to do here is just to stand in melee range to avoid charges. They also cast Dragonbane Axe, a cast that applies a bleed to a random party member. At the center of the hall is an Iron Torch Commander. They're not too dangerous, but they have a lot of health. They cast Conflagrant Fusillade, spawning large circles around every player. It's unavoidable, so just don't overlap with your teammates. They also cast Conflagrant Battery, spawning multiple swirlies around the commander for several seconds. It's just a lot of dodging. The commander is fairly easy to skip, so I wouldn't be surprised if some routes avoid him. Past that commanders are some blacksmiths. Blacksmiths can be dangerous. They cast Forge Stomp, a 2-second cast which does unavoidable damage to the entire party. And they also cast Reverberating Slam, a tank buster that also does additional damage over 9 seconds. And finally, the most cursed mob in this entire area, the Forge Rot Monstrosity. Upon pulling the Monstrosity, they gain Forge Rot Fury, which causes them to pulse for some damage indefinitely. This means you'll need to kill them before the damage overwhelms you. Fortunately, that's all there is to it. But those of you who played this dungeon in Season 1 might have noticed a missing ability. In the past, when the Fury hits 20% health, they'll begin casting Blazing Detonation, an 8-second cast where if you don't kill it, they will explode, killing everyone. Fortunately, they don't do that anymore. And now we're at the third boss, Forgemaster Gorek. The boss only has 3 abilities, really easy. The boss normally starts by casting Might of the Forge. He'll jump to the forge and begin to hammer the anvil. He strikes it 3 times and each hammer strike deals group-wide damage. After forging the Aegis, he'll throw it at 3 players, dealing damage to any players caught in a small AoE. So don't stack. When the shield lands, it shoots out swirlies in 4 directions, so spread out lightly and get ready to dodge. He will then often follow it up with Heated Swing. He will strike the tank twice, first to knock the tank up, and then to knock the tank back. Then, a few seconds after that, he will jump and slam at the tank's position, leaving behind a puddle of fire. Just be careful of your positionings, tanks. And finally, the boss's last ability, Forge Storm. He'll throw his hammer into the forge, and the forge will proceed to spit out multiple swirlies around the arena. Just avoid these. The boss repeats this cycle of abilities, and that's it. Quite a simple boss fight. Upon defeating the boss, you can pick up the Blazing Aegis if you have blacksmithing at level 25 or higher. Picking it up grants you an extra action ability, exactly the same ability the boss has. You know, the one where he spawns swirlies in 4 directions? That's the one. We're on the home stretch. You make your way down the path to the last boss. The first pack you meet will contain 2 Kalashi Wardens and 1 Apex Blazewing. We've seen the Wardens before in the first area. The Blazewing is actually quite dangerous. Their first ability is Scalding Chomp, a tank buster that applies a dot to the tank. But in my PTR testing, they don't seem to cast it anymore. Their big ability, however, is still around. Candescent Tempest is where they continuously flap their wings. This deals damage and pushes players away. You will need to beware of your positioning here. Melee DPS, expect to lose some uptime here. Amazingly, there's only one other unique mob in this dungeon, and that's the Kalashi Lavamancer. The Lavamancer has 3 abilities. First is Lava Bolt at the tank, just a direct damage cast. Then, when they get to below 40% health, they will cast Molten Barrier, causing them to be immune to interrupts. And then they'll start casting their big ability, Molten Army, continuously creating lava spawns every 3 seconds for 24 seconds. The lava spawns don't actually do anything, but it's never good to have more mobs than you need. The cast of Molten Army can be interrupted, so you'll need to first break the barrier as fast as you can so that you can interrupt it. This will require some priority damage. The Lavamancer also leaves behind a puddle of lava upon death. Nothing too impactful. And that's all the trash in this dungeon. And now you make your way to the last boss, Warlord Sargha. I imagine this boss to be quite difficult at higher levels, especially if you don't have the correct dispel types in the group. The boss normally starts the fight by casting Dragon's Kill. It's just a large frontal that needs to be sidestepped. It targets a random player, so beware. The boss also casts Molten Gold, applying a dot to a random party member. It's just something for a healer to do. Then the boss might cast Burning Ember, spawning a Raging Ember and some burning ground around it. The Ember will fixate on a random player, chase them, and put lava puddles where they walk. You should generally kill it, but good groups will probably just use their CC on it. At some point before they cast their ultimate, the boss will throw treasure all around the room. Interacting with these gold piles will grant you 1 of 5 different abilities at random. Picking it up, however, also grants you a curse that does quite a bit of damage. It lasts 5 minutes and stacks, so you can't possibly hope to drop it off naturally. Because of this dungeon at any reasonable key level basically demands a decurse. If you don't have one, this fight becomes considerably harder. All the artifacts serve the same purpose. They deal a significant amount of damage to shields. This is important. It only does damage to shields. Don't use this on the boss just because you think it'll do damage. At 100 energy, the boss will cast his ultimate, Magma Shield. It is a significant shield that you cannot hope to DPS with raw damage. Rather, you use the treasures you gained earlier. Based on my testing, it seems 3 treasures will take out 90% of the shield's health, and you could probably do the last 10% with your damage alone. While the shield persists, the boss will deal continuous damage to the entire party every 3 seconds for 45 seconds, applying a stacking debuff that causes the party to take 50% more damage for every subsequent hit. This is a race. All the while, during the shield phase, several swirlies will spawn around the room called Dragon Eruptions that you'll need to dodge. It is very chaotic, and it is quite difficult. Breaking the shield will stun the boss for 5 seconds. This fight is a very healing intensive fight, especially if you don't have decurses. I would not be surprised if this boss receives quite a few tuning changes over the weeks. But with that, that's the end of the dungeon. The dungeon doesn't have too many unique enemies, and the enemies are fairly straightforward. A pleasant change from what I feel are overloaded packs in some of the Season 1 dungeons. I make these videos to give players a full overview of dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. If you found this helpful, be sure to leave a like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next dungeon guide.